All right. Well, today on the show, we normally have one guest, but today we have the privilege of three guests who are coming on today on the Churchology podcast. And we're excited because today we're going to recap the events of the Southern Baptist Convention that happened just a couple of weeks ago, and also look forward for what it could mean in the future. And so I am going to let everybody introduce themselves, and we'll start with Hannah Kate. Now, Hannah Kate, if people have been listening to the podcast for a while, you are the very first ever repeat guest on the Churchology podcast. And so I wish there was a prize. I wish there was something that was in the mail to you to honor this occasion. And we'll just pretend that it is. So Hannah Kate, go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody that's watching and listening if you don't care to.
My name is Hannah Kate. I am a student at the University of Kentucky here in Lexington. I am a survivor of sexual abuse within the SBC, and so a lot of what I put out on social media tends to relate to that issue. But I also just enjoy life with my cat. That's me.
Grant, go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience.
Okay, I'm Grant Gaines. I'm a pastor in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. Been here for a couple of years. Before that, pastored in Jackson, Tennessee, and West Tennessee for 8 years. I'm married to my wife, Melissa, and we've got 5 children and a dog.
There you go. And Griffin, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Griffin Gulledge. I'm pastor of Madison Baptist Church in Madison, Georgia. I've been here about 5 months now, and we're married to Rachel. We met when I was at Beeson Divinity School, and we just welcomed our first child, Rosemary, into the world. She's still in the hospital now, but she's doing great, and yeah, I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Excellent, excellent. And this conversation, just to give credit to where credit is due, this was Hannah Kate's idea. So she sent me something on Twitter, and I just thought it was an awesome idea. And everybody willing to jump onto the podcast to really talk about what happened at the SBC in terms of steps that were taken to move forward for survivors of sexual abuse. And so Grant, let's start with you. You know, people that are watching, listening, a lot of them are out of the SBC, or maybe they're in and just, you know, their familiarity with how the convention works and what may have happened. They're not really familiar with it. Can you just talk to us, for everybody that's watching, listening, fill us in on what made this year's convention so significant for the issue of sexual abuse in the SBC?
Sure. Well, you know, I think going into this SBC, a lot of people had a lot of issues on their minds, but I think, and maybe, you know, Griffin, you might agree or disagree, I think in just a few weeks leading right up to the start of the SBC, the letters that became public from Russell Moore turned the conversation and made the issue of sexual abuse the number one focus of the convention that year. Now, obviously, that was not when this issue became an issue. You know, Hannah Kate and other brave SBC survivors have been talking about this for a long, long time. And it's really to our shame that it took something like Russell Moore's letters to make it a more widespread concern. But that's the way it happened. And really, it's because of voices like Hannah Kate's, who have been speaking to this issue for years, and then finally, just in God's timing, I think, brought it to our attention. And so that, I think, it became the dominant theme and the thing that everybody said, okay, this is something we got to deal with. I think leading up to it, we all thought we were going to be simply talking about CRT and then, you know, a couple of other issues. But I'm glad, you know, I think this was the issue that we needed to address. And so those letters came out. And then I can go into some of the details about our motion and things like that and the different dynamics that were at play. But that's what I think made this issue to come to the forefront.
Yeah. And so Hannah Kate, with everything that Grant just set up, I would love to hear what was your kind of mindset going into the SBC, and then were those letters that were released, did that change your mindset? Did you see, like Grant said, did you see something kind of shift in the conversation as well when those letters were released?
I did. So about a month before the letters were released, I hit kind of a rock bottom in my walk with God, my thoughts on the church, my hopes for the church. If you remember our last conversation,
Mm-hmm.
I had a lot of high expectations and things that I really believed God would do before those letters were leaked. I just was at a place where I thought there's one's going to listen, nothing's going to change. I was just over it and I was devastated. And then when those letters came out and people started paying attention and people started listening and people started talking about our stories, I thought, this is God saying, I'm not done yet with the broken. And it gave me hope, because I would not have gone to the Southern Baptist Convention with the mindset I had a month before
Wow.
those letters.
Yeah.
Yeah, Griffin, can you just tell our audience, for everybody watching, what were those letters, and speak for yourself there. Why do you personally think those letters were really significant to what happened?
Well, the letters we're talking about is a series of leaked letters, and then a whistleblower account that came out of the ERLC. The ERLC has been probably the most vocal, definitely the most vocal institutional advocate for abuse reform in the Southern Baptist Convention. And it's been obvious that they've come up against a few brick walls here and there. And but the question publicly has been sort of why is this so difficult to address? Why do we seem to not be getting this right? Why are abuse survivors not happy with actions we're taking? Why do they still feel like they're being ignored? And what we saw in these leaked letters, which were really a leaked accounting from Russell Moore, written to Southern Baptist Convention President J.D. Greer, of the ways in which internal mechanisms and systems and people within the SBC have been resisting reform, fighting back and maligning those who have called for reform, and prioritizing the so-called base of the SBC, whatever that is, over the testimony and witness of victims and other whistleblowers. And so they really drew attention to, hey, there's still a significant resistance to reform and accountability. And that's the key, not just token reforms. Yeah, of course, we're not going to allow churches who just hire a child molester as pastor. That's great. With no mechanism for enforcement, no mechanism for accountability. And so what you see in these letters is where that resistance is coming from. And then as the claim is made that these letters are somehow not truthful or misrepresenting the situation, Philip Bethencourt, formerly the executive vice president of the ERLC, releases recordings. Now they are, I think it's important to say, they are edited, selective recordings, but really they speak for themselves. They are verbatim saying some of the things that these letters point to, in the sense of seeing abuse reform and accountability as sort of an us versus them. Hey, we need to protect ourselves here. When in reality, to quote Russell Moore, we need to not do any more stupid stuff. And those letters shone the light to Southern Baptists who had maybe mistakenly convinced themselves, oh, well, didn't we vote on that last convention? Didn't we have a resolution about that? Didn't we start a standing credentials committee? It showed them, hey, this is continuing. It is a problem. We have not gone far enough, and this conversation is not over.
Yeah, yeah. Something that really that I would love to ask for Grant and Griffin, you two as pastors, can you just speak to? We'll just go back to Griffin, but this is for both of you. I would love to hear, why is this an issue that you really want to stand for and speak up about, other than the fact that it is the right thing to do. It is what every pastor should be doing. We can have a conversation about that. But you two, here you are, and Grant, we're going to get into in just a second about the motion that you made at the SBC. I would love to hear what is it specifically for both of you that said this. I'm gonna speak up about this. This is going to be an issue that I give a lot of work towards. Griffin, what is that for you?
Some people read accounts like we've heard of sexual abuse, and they say, this could be your mother, this could be your daughter, this could be your relative or loved one. For me, it's not a could be, it's an is. There are rape victims in my family. There are sexual abuse victims in my family, my loved ones who've been molested, my loved ones who've been abused, whose abusers have not faced accountability. And the Houston Chronicle wrote an article about sexual abusers in churches, and one of the youth ministers who was molesting kids molested a friend of mine from college. And I had no idea. He reached out to me after I shared the article. It is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But we would not stand for it. We wouldn't tolerate it if we didn't speak up. And there is a narrative out there that somehow those of us who are speaking up would be stopped if more Southern Baptists were paying attention and cared about their autonomy and whatever. When I came back to my church, I did a Southern Baptist Convention report where I shared what was going on, and they were furious that these things have been covered up, that we have not done more. I think sometimes people get so wrapped up in Southern Baptist Convention politics that they forget that we are the Roman Catholic Church of the 2020s. We are the scandal. We're the story that's scandalizing the world. We're the shame that's being brought upon the name of Jesus Christ, because we have turned a blind eye to people in their greatest time of need. Read the parable of the Good Samaritan. We are the Pharisees crossing the street. And then in the cases of us institutionally bringing further harm to victims, we're not just like the people who cross the street and ignore harm that's done. Sometimes we've been the people who've beat them up in the first place and throw them in the ditch. And I think my church is not going to stand for it. And I'm not going to stand for it. It is the right thing to do. And if we're going to have any credibility to our Christian witness about a God who does justice on the cross and who gives justice to the oppressed and who will take pain and suffering out of this world, we can't pretend not to care or like we've got better things going on when it is happening in our midst.
Yeah. Yeah. Grant, same question to you.
All of those reasons. I mean, do justice.
Yeah.
Love kindness, walk humbly with your God. And there's no greater form of injustice than vulnerable people being taken advantage of. And then to know how prevalent it is. I think that's what the Houston Chronicle article showed, was just how prevalent it is in the SBC and in churches like ours. And then to know, the stat that's often thrown around, which is 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men are abused, before the age of 18. And so it's happening, and we've got to deal with it. My church responded the same way. I came back. I think everybody comes back from the convention not knowing what to expect from their church members the next Sunday, and especially if you've been at all involved in what's happened in the convention. I came back, and everybody in our church was thrilled that we're finally starting to take this seriously in our convention. And I think that was reflected in the room in the convention too. You know, the overwhelming support for this. And so I just think it's time. You know, it's past time, but you go, now is the time.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll talk about what it was like there in the room here in just a minute. But Grant, tell us. So, Grant, you made the motion, correct?
Yes, but
Yeah.
Ronnie Parrott and I, all right, Ronnie Parrott is a pastor in North Carolina, Christ Community Church. And right after Russell Moore's first letter came out, we started communicating and we said, hey, the executive committee has got some explaining to do, you know, because they're explicitly named in these letters as being resistant to reform, as in some cases, you know, intimidating survivors, as dismissing cases from survivors, and as not taking this seriously. And so when their chairman, when that committee is mentioned, our thought was they've got some explaining to do. You know, and then the question is, well, how do you get them to do any explaining? How do you hold the executive committee responsible? And I think that the beautiful thing about, you know, a congregationalist type of polity that not only that happens in our churches, but that happens at the convention level is any messenger to the convention has some level of authority and the opportunity to do just that. And so our thought was, let's just make a motion from the floor. I think this would have overwhelming support from any messenger that has a heart and that has any desire to see truth come to light. And so that was the rationale behind that. Now, I'll tell you this, our hope from the beginning was that the executive committee itself would get out ahead of this and would call for all of this themselves and would want to get this right themselves. But we heard crickets for days after these letters came out. And not until public pressure was put on them did they start kind of backpedaling and then you know, trying to kind of actually do something about it. But so that's how it all kind of started.
And specifically, what was the motion?
Okay, so after the second letter then came out, so finally they, after about a week, I think it was, the executive committee finally said, well, we'll do an investigation. So they entered into a contract with Guidepost, which is a reputable, you know, investigative firm that specializes in abuse. And the problem, though, that we saw with that was, you know, the executive committee was still kind of holding the reins in terms of setting the terms for this investigation. They didn't put anything in their announcement about the investigation, about how public the findings would be in the report and all of those things, about the scope of the investigation, nothing in there about attorney-client privilege. I mean, so basically, and what we were hearing a lot from survivors as well was, listen, the way that they have worded this, the investigation that they have set up so far means nothing. They won't do anything unless the terms of this investigation are really specific, unless the findings are made public, unless Guidepost has access to all the information they need, which would necessitate some waiving of privilege. Unless all those things are in place, these types of investigations really aren't thorough anyways, and so they're useless. And so that was our thinking behind it as well. So our motion was to make it, to form a task force that would be independent of the executive committee, that would be appointed by the newly elected president, which wound up being Ed Litton. And then that task force, which was to be made up of some members of SBC churches, it's also open to being for people who are just experts in the field to be on it as well. That task force would then be the ones that actually entered into a contract with whatever firm they want to enter into a contract with. They would be the ones setting the terms of the investigation, setting the scope of the investigation, giving progress reports and being the liaison and the middleman, so to speak, between the firm and the executive committee. And so our thought was, if we really want this investigation to be thorough, if we want to be neutral, if we want it to be independent, then the executive committee can't be investigating itself. It can't be setting the terms of the agreement itself. Yeah. It can't be reporting the findings itself. They're the ones under investigation, so they can't be in charge of the investigation. So I think just desire to make it neutral and objective, and I think that was the only way to do it. They weren't evidently willing to do that themselves, and so we went to the floor and asked that that be done. And the messengers responded overwhelmingly.
Yeah. And Hannah Kate, when that happened, when the messengers responded the way that they did, what was that like? What was that moment like?
It was very surprising. I kept asking Grant the whole convention, like, is this gonna work? Is this gonna work? Are they gonna do the right thing? And he just had this confidence that everything was going to work out. I will say, the day before the actual meeting, when the motion was brought, it was Monday, and I and a group of survivors of sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention had issued a joint statement the week before, pretty much summarizing what we were asking between both Grant and Ronnie's motion and then Todd Benkirk's motion, specific changes that we thought we needed for transparency in the SBC to move forward. And so all day Monday, I passed out copies of those, and the conversations a lot of times would start off like defensive. Like, people were like, why are we talking about this? This isn't that big of a deal. This is a liberal agenda. But what was really incredible to see was just how the Holy Spirit works through kindness and through gentleness and through the things he's called us to and through patience, and how he works on our hearts individually and on the hearts of those listening to us. So the start of the conversation might be rough, but a majority of them ended up on a good note, where people were like, oh, I get it now. Oh, I see the face with the name. Oh, now I understand how prevalent it was. And I mean, I talked to thousands of people that day, and I mean, the majority was just this seeing God transform them from being blind to the sin in the convention to seeing it and being ready to reckon with it. And I think that was really powerful for me to see. And then when the motion was actually made on Tuesday, there was a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety. What if this doesn't go through? What if this is the last conversation the SBC ever has about sexual abuse and we're back at square one? But to hear the words that Grant chose, and that he chose with such intention, to see a pastor stand up for so many when those he's standing up for have been most harmed by pastors, to see that redemptive moment, and then to follow it with Wednesday and see just, there were so many different things that God did, so many small things that all came together, and you really saw the significance of each member of the body of Christ coming together when they reckon with the sin that their collective sin, and when they truly want to turn away from it. And then when those ballads were raised, I was standing next to two of my favorite people. There were other survivors, and I mean, we just grabbed each other and we just sobbed because we couldn't believe that God truly was as faithful to not leave the church in sin as he was on Wednesday. So it was a really powerful, I'll never forget it.
Wow. Wow. So let's dig in into this for a little bit. So Griffin, let me go to you. I know that there are people who are watching this and listening to this, and they're hearing this, and it, you know, they're leaned in, but the question in their mind is, what is the executive committee? And so can you just explain to our non-SBC listeners and a lot of our SBC listeners as well, what is the executive committee?
Well, it's in the book of Hebrew. No, it's not. It's not in the Bible. It's not a church office. You know, the executive committee is an administrative committee that has some ad interim fiduciary responsibility in the Southern Baptist Convention. And in general, if you ask people, name 5 people on the executive committee, they would come up goose egg on you most of the time. It is supposed to be sort of the invisible hand of the Southern Baptist Convention, that they promote cooperative program giving, that they promote our entities. And when the convention is not in meeting together, so the Southern Baptist Convention only technically exists the 2 days a year that it's meeting. When it's not meeting, what the executive committee does is it does the things that are specifically not enumerated for the gathered convention to do. It does those things in their place throughout the year. What are those things? They receive and distribute cooperative program dollars. They promote the cooperative program. They promote cooperation among our churches. And they have representatives from every state. And they make sure that our entities, you know, they hear reports from our entities throughout the year and make sure that they are upholding our Constitution and bylaws and fulfilling their ministry assignment. It's not a powerful organization. Typically, they have a few other responsibilities like Baptist Press, which is not an independent press agency. Baptist Press does a great job at reporting on what's going on in the SBC, but they are not an independent journalistic enterprise. They don't have investigative reporting. It is a little more than a PR firm, because there is a PR wing of the executive committee. But the executive committee has a very important role in the life of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is to make sure that we're fulfilling our ministry assignments, promote our cooperative tasks together, and distribute money. What has happened at the executive committee that is such a problem is that people have used this committee to aggregate power to themselves and exercise undue influence in our convention. And so you see, for example, groups who begin to pull in the ERLC and strong arm them into not speaking on certain things under the guise of, well, maybe it'll hurt cooperative program giving. You know, the ministry assignment to endorse or to enhance cooperative program giving is not, it's a job. It's not a threat. They're supposed to be there to support the work of the convention, but they have had a chairman who, under executive session outside of a place where he could be questioned, pulls together a task force to investigate the ERLC. And they're investigating the ERLC for dividing the convention. But then they produce a report, which is not voted on by the EC, not adopted, not even verified with facts, that makes ridiculous claims like that George Soros is funneling money to the ERLC. Look, George Soros funneling money to evangelical organization. I've been accused of that. And look, if George is handing out checks, I'm still waiting on my first one. And I think Russell Moore is too. And what you have seen at best out of the executive committee is negligence, and at worst it is harm. A lot of people don't know that an abuse victim took the executive committee into a lawsuit last year, which they then settled outside of court for a huge sum of money because they libeled her in Baptist press. And what they did and admitted to in the course of that was that an article was written that executive committee leaders then amended and insisted on changing to misrepresent this woman, first written as an abuse victim, but published as a harlot, as an adulteress, even though what was committed against her was a violent act of sexual abuse repeatedly over the course of a decade. That was the executive committee's action. Of course, they didn't report those workings to the Southern Baptist Convention. No questions were ever asked. It was all done under the guise of their private and small meetings. Also, executive committee has repeatedly had abuse victims come to them and tell them that pastors are sexually abusing women, children, young boys, and moving from church to church without any accountability. And again, at best, the executive committee has said, sorry, there's nothing we can do. We can't help local church autonomy. But local church autonomy has become a mantra, sort of like Cain saying to God in the garden, or outside, right outside the garden, am I my brother's keeper? It's just them saying, we can't help, even though there are many ways that they could assist in keeping track of abusers and making sure that churches who hire sexual abusers are not able to continue in good fellowship with our convention. So at best, they were negligent. At worst, well, we now have private correspondence of them insulting advocates like Krista Brown, calling these women and men divisive, attacking them as somehow agents of Satan, and doing so alongside other entity heads like Paige Patterson. And then we find out that when someone has insulted or attacked an abuse victim like Paige Patterson, you have the executive vice president of the executive committee, Augie Bodo, who in court says that he is actively working alongside, or is credibly verified to have actively worked alongside this group to funnel money away from one of our entities into an organization led by Paige Patterson. The executive committee is supposed to be a quiet, invisible, small group of people that supports our cooperative work and distributes money. And it has become a place that people aggregate power to themselves and try to act like bishops over the SBC, and have wielded that power not for the good of abuse victims, but for themselves, and to silence and malign those victims. And it really is a shame, because there are countless good and godly men and women who have been on the executive committee and served faithfully. It is not the majority of them who have done this, but the people who could do it have done it. And it has caused us to be in the situation that we're in now.
Wow. Yeah, that's well said. So I guess my question is for Grant. So Grant, having made the motion passes in light of everything that Griffin just told us about the executive committee. What I guess could happen as a result of this independent investigation to the SBC? What are, I guess, maybe goals that you have in your mind, or what could happen to the executive committee as a result of this independent investigation?
I think that's yet to be seen. I mean, I think the main thing that I hope happens is that the stories that survivors have been telling will be heard by the convention. That's the main, I think that's the main win. I'm sure there could be disciplinary action that comes. I'm sure there's a lot of different course corrections and things, but the main purpose behind our motion is to go back and make things right where we have wronged survivors when they've spoken up. It's hard enough for them to speak up. When we then don't listen to them or shut them down after they've spoken up and mustered the courage to do that, that's horrible. And so this is to go back and to shine a light, bring it into the light. Whatever's in the darkness, we need to bring it to the light. We need to know where we have failed, even if it's a lot of failure, if it's horrible failure. We need to look that failure right in the eye, so we know what we've done, so that we never do it again. That to me is the main purpose of this. Now, Todd Benkert, we can talk about this if you want, also got another motion passed, referred to the RLC, and action will be taken there. And he's going to be looking at the present state of kind of what's happening, the patterns of abuse in churches right now, from testimonies from survivors and others, so that we can know how to move into the future. But our motion was about dealing with the wrongs we've done in the past, making sure justice is done there, making sure the survivors are heard, making sure anything that was done in the cover of darkness is brought into the light, because we can't move forward if it means leaving survivors behind. And so that's what our motion is meant to do.
Yeah.
And Mark, if I could just add, I think something that would bring some clarity to what is going on here. Before Grant made his motion to bring this to the floor of the convention, the same effort was made the morning of the convention in the executive committee's plenary session. I was sitting in the room when it happened. Jared Wellman asked them to take this step of accountability. They voted it down to even discuss it. They weren't even willing to discuss it. And one of the men on the executive committee said, this is shameful and harmful to our convention. We're not investigating our churches. Let's be clear. Nothing here is being done to investigate our churches. Our churches will still retain full autonomy. The Southern Baptist Convention is not a denomination that has the power to investigate local churches, but what we can do is have a real commitment with some teeth to it, to not cooperate with churches that tolerate and hire abusers and enable abusers. And then secondly, the idea that we're investigating churches is such a joke, because what we're really doing is investigating ourselves. There are institutional failures in handling abuse at Southeastern Seminary, Southwestern Seminary, ironically under the same president both times. At one of the abusers was a professor at Southern Seminary. There's been an institutional failure in handling abuse at the International Mission Board. There has been a church planner and pastor who was just arrested on sexual abuse charges, who is supported by the North American Mission Board last month. Now, there's no evidence that they enabled him or knew anything or empowered any of that or covered anything up, but this is a problem. This is a widespread problem. And when the Baptist press is losing lawsuits for libeling an abuse victim, we're not needing to investigate all the local churches. We need to investigate the institutions and ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing? If you ask any pastor, they'll tell you, my counseling classes in seminary weren't enough. I'm not an expert on this. I didn't learn about this. I'm not equipped to handle this. And for a long time, we have been handling it without the skills, the ability, the knowledge, the equipping, and we have been mishandling it. Sometimes maliciously, sometimes good-intentioned people have mishandled it. But we can't just say, oh, well, I meant well. We have to look at our institutions and say, do we have the policies in place? Do we have the accountability structures in place? And what have we done wrong? How can we support these victims at the convention level? That's what this is about. This is not, the SBC's equivalent FBI force isn't going to show up at your church and start digging through your deacons meeting minutes. This has nothing to do with any of that. That's a false narrative. It's that our institutions at the highest level have mishandled it. And that's what we've got to figure out.
Yeah. So Hannah Kate, thinking about moving forward, Grant actually used those words a moment ago. What would you like to see from this moving forward? Grant also mentioned the other motion that was brought forward as well. What would you, when you put all of these things together as a result of what happened in Nashville, what would you like to see? What are a few things you'd like to see happen moving forward?
I think first, not a repeat of 2019 when we had our little moral campaign where we had survivors stand up and we cried a prayer of repentance but didn't put any action behind it. I would like to see my fellow survivors heard and respected, and when they are heard, for pastors not to argue with them on why they're unreasonable for wanting to be safe and wanting to protect the vulnerable. I think a lot of times pastors will come to survivors and they'll say, we finally know that we need to listen to you. We finally want to hear what you have to say. And then when we lay out specific policies or changes that need to be made, they argue with us like we're crazy, like we're asking too much. And I think that needs to change. Honestly, what I would like to see, I would like for everything that comes out of the investigation to be used in a way that pursues justice for the survivors. I would like survivors to be able to have the opportunity and the resources to take the necessary legal action against those on the executive committee who have caused harm, to take action against those who have enabled abuse, who have intimidated survivors from speaking to police, who have tried to force non-disclosure agreements onto the victims of their churches. I would like to see churches provide legal aid for when a survivor comes forward in their church. I would like it to be common practice for when there is an allegation of sexual abuse for a church to, at a local level, remove that person, go through a process, obviously go through law enforcement, but what we know is only 1 in every 235 cases of sexual abuse are ever prosecuted. And the average sentence for that prosecuted case is anywhere from 6 to 8 months. So I think in an effort to live above reproach, as the church has been called to do, I think the common practice should be to hire an independent investigator, a third-party investigator, to go through those claims as well, because everything that an independent investigator can find, well, you know what? They can bring that to the police. That helps the victim in their pursuit of justice. That helps the church in maintaining a reputation of honoring and valuing the victims. And that also shows a heart for the perpetrator, because when we at local and state and national levels choose to turn a blind eye, we are not only saying to the victim, hey, you're not worth it. We are telling these perpetrators, these fellow pastors, these people that we say we respect, we are telling them that their souls are not worth saving. We are telling them that we are okay with them remaining in sin and being destroyed by their actions. And you know, we are called to love the perpetrator and the victim, and how we do that is through the pursuit of justice, because through justice there is mercy, and that is what we have been called to as the church.
Yeah. You know, a
And
question.
the verdict's still out on this task on the investigation too. So I'm cautiously optimistic. But it could still be messed up. And so my hope is that they will be very transparent about their process. I hope that this task force, for example, will make public as much as they possibly can legally in a way that won't jeopardize the investigation, but they'll make public the terms and scope of the investigation. I hope they'll give periodic updates throughout the course of the investigation. And I hope they'll do a full public, they'll make fully public the results of the investigation. And I think that will tell us a lot as to, whether or not the investigation is thorough and can be trusted.
Yeah.
And just another thing is, this has to be an ongoing conversation. This can't be like we did in 2008, where, sexual abuse was brought to the table and we said, oh, well, we made a resolution back in 2002 on how seminaries should train their pastors to not be abusers. No. As culture changes, as time changes, as power dynamics change, as institution changes, we have to continue this conversation, because we know back from Bible times that sexual abuse and sexual assault is always going to be prevalent as long as there is sin on earth. And so we can't just say, hey, we gave a good solid 2 years to survivors. No, we have to start thinking about the children that are going to be born in the next generation and how we're going to defend and protect them. And we can't just limit it to what we have experienced. We have to be vigilant, and we have to look to the future and constantly be evaluating ourselves before God and before his standards to see, are we protecting the vulnerable? Are we defending the cause of the righteous? Are we pursuing justice? That has to be an ongoing conversation throughout the years.
And I think that has to be at two levels in SBC. There has to be an ongoing conversation for pastors in their local churches. And one way to do that, I'm working through Boz's book right now, and we've done some other things already, but he talks about setting up a committee in your church that will be dedicated to, like a child protection committee or something, a standing group of people that will be there to make sure this remains an emphasis every year in an ongoing way. At the convention level, this is another one of the reasons I still think we need a strong ethics and religious liberty commission. They can, we all should care about it, convention, but we need an entity that can champion this in an ongoing way at a convention level. And ethics and the ERLC would be an obvious choice for that. And so whoever they get to be their next president, I hope that we will make sure it's somebody that will make this a cause that we champion from here on out.
Yeah, and also not just at a local church level. Something I've seen repeated in just different people's cases and what we've brought to the credentials committee and the response. We need to use our leaders in the local associations and in the state associations. It should not take going to Twitter and getting national SBC attention for pastors and churches to be addressed on these issues. We need our directors of missions. We need our executive directors of our local and state associations to be vigilant and to meet with these pastors and to ask these pastors, what policies do you have in place? What are you doing in the future? State associations should be having regular trainings for their pastors to attend on this issue. And I think, personally, I think two of the largest unreached, unengaged people groups in the US are survivors of sexual abuse and pastors themselves. Because the survivors, if you look at how many people are leaving the church on a regular basis, I put out something about a year ago talking about the church's response to my sexual abuse. Well, I got over 30,000 responses with comments, and it was all from people who were a part of a church. And the reason they left the church was because the church mishandled their abuse. And if we want to reach the nations, we have to reach the people that God has right in front of us, that God has in our pews. And then when we think about pastors, if this is so prevalent amongst pastors, why are we not ministering to them? Why are we not calling them to repentance? Why are we not teaching them what the gospel actually says? Why are we not practicing healthy church discipline? We're just leaving them in their sin to perish. And that in and of itself is a tragedy.
Yeah.
I think, Mark, one thing I would add, I hope comes out of this, is just culture change in our convention. I've been a Southern Baptist my entire life, a lot like Grant has been. In fact, my dad pastored right down the road from Grant's dad in Alabama during my childhood. I was on the, what did they call it? The cradle roll, the crib roll. I came up through Children's Ministries, VBS. I probably hold some record for most VBSs attended at Southern Baptist churches, because I would go to all of the ones in the county for free childcare throughout the year. But I am a devoted Southern Baptist, and I know all about Lottie Moon and Annie Armstrong and the Great Commission. The Great Commission is our marching orders, but it is not a rival to our attention on matters of justice. And I am not willing to stomach one more time someone to talk about issues of sexual abuse as if it is a distraction from our mission. It is our mission, period. Jesus is going to heal the centurion's son, and a woman reaches out and touches his robe for healing. He didn't tell her, hey, go away, you're distracting me. She was the mission in that moment, on his way to another part of his mission. And we have talked about, well, we can't provide resources because it'd take away from cooperative program dollars, and we can't admit what we've done because maybe we'll establish a sending liability and we'll be vulnerable to lawsuits, and wouldn't that hurt our IMB missionaries? And we can't create systems of accountability because then maybe our church planning efforts will look like it's top down rather than a bottom up. And we're so desperately afraid of doing anything as if somehow it's going to harm or distract us from our real calling. This is our real calling: to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. I know that as Southern Baptists, we're going to beat the drum of the Great Commission to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jesus is with us for that purpose to the end of the age. But Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is this, to love your neighbor as yourself. We are, whatever it means to fulfill the Great Commission, it may mean funding IMB missionaries, it may mean planting churches all over this country, but whatever it means, we are not doing it if we're not loving our neighbors as ourselves. These things are not mutually exclusive. And what I want to see in the Southern Baptist Convention is for us to stop talking about issues of justice as if they're a threat to us. Stop talking about these things as if they're a distraction from what we should really be doing. We don't get to choose one command of Jesus and isolate it as if it's more important than all the other things. We are guilty of some of the things that Jesus says about holding up, pulling the speck out of our brother's eye, not pulling the log out of our own eye. And I hope that we have a culture change that bangs the drum of Great Commission in such a way that we understand that these things are part of that mission and that they affect our Christian witness. This is not, we can't get in a situation like we have gotten into them, conversations on race, where we say, well, we did that in 1995 or 2005 or whatever. How many times are we going to have to bring this up? As long as children aren't safe in our churches, that's how many times. As long as this keeps happening, this is like, how many times do I forgive my brother? 7 times? 7 times, 70 times. Same thing here. How many times do we protect the vulnerable? How many times do we do justice? 7 times? No, 7 times, 70 times. And I know I'm taking that verse out of context. Somebody might say, that's not what the verse is about. I got it. It's not. It's an analogy. We have got to have culture change that says that this is a priority and not just for 2 years.
Yeah. And, to your point, Griffin, it really is part of the Great Commission, because the Great Commission is go, make disciples, baptize them, and teach them to obey all that I have commanded you. Like, that part of the Great Commission is also part of the Great Commission. Right. And teaching them all Christ commanded includes things like love your neighbor as yourself, includes things like do justice. And so literally, if we're really making disciples and fulfilling the whole Great Commission, then we will be teaching people to care for survivors. We'll be teaching people to do justice when it comes to sexual abuse or racism or any number of justice issues that are there in our churches. And so it's definitely a part of our mission.
Yeah. And, one of the things that you guys have already kind of said here is this story is in no way finished. Nashville was just a few weeks ago. Ed Litton, the newly elected president, just announced the task force that he's put together. So many times there's an effort to control the narrative. And so as this story continues to unfold, and really, one of you said it, I think it might have been Hannah Kate. I mean, in the years ahead, as this story continues to unfold, what are some things that we should be watching for? What are some things, I'd love to hear your comments on this. What are some things that people should be watching for, as this story continues to unfold, knowing that, there are efforts to control narratives. There are efforts to, shift stories and hide the truth and that sort of thing. Is there anything that comes to your mind that people should be watching for as this story unfolds, to continue to put the pressure on to call for truth, to bring things out of darkness into light? Anything that comes to your mind? We can go to Grant first, or anybody else, but Grant, anything that comes to your mind, people, we should be watching for this. Anything in particular?
Well, and most immediately, we should be watching for a really good and thorough investigation. And that task force has also been charged. This segues into, I think, the most important thing. That task force has also been charged with coming to us with recommended action steps to take. And let me just say, that's where we will test the mettle of the SBC. Until we start actually doing things, until we start actually taking action, until we start actually showing that we're going to do something about it, it's all just a bunch of talk. And so, and survivors have heard a lot of talk, and what they deserve is our action. And so that's what I'll be looking for. Those actions could be a number of things. We've mentioned some of them already, but one of the things that's been called for a long time is, at the very least, some kind of database, so that people can't just go from church to church and hop around, so that they are, so that we can know. Our church right now is in the process of hiring several positions, and it would be very helpful to have a database with names on it, so that we would know who not to hire. So some specific action steps, that's one of many that should be taken. So that's my response to that for now.
I think a couple of, I'll name a number of things. I'll just do them quickly. One is, will the report be made public and unedited? If we get a highly redacted report, that's not enough. If we get a report that they say, here's a summary of the report, but you can't read it, that's not enough. If we refuse to name names, like real people were part of these things, and we just are sorry that vague things happen, but we're not willing to acknowledge how they happened or who did it, I think that's a problem. That's not the level of honesty that we need. But I think this credentials committee that is standing now to examine questions of sexual abuse in our convention, sexual abuse victims are not happy with the reception of the things that they are sending to that committee and the way that it is being handled, or even their capability to handle these questions, or how equipped they are to even reach out to churches who are accused of mishandling it. It is, it's the institutional equivalent of saying, be warmed and filled, but not giving them clothes or food. Will it have teeth? Will our actions have actual teeth? I think another question is going to be, will the ERLC investigation be thorough and give us a public reporting and accounting of these things? At the end of the day, I could list off 10 or 15 more things that are going to be critical. But I think that what Grant has said and what I have said all boils down to, are we going to be honest or not? We got to bring the darkness into the light, and we have hidden enough things. We have silenced enough people. It is time in this report, and what Grant and Ronnie have called for and what Todd has called for, it is time to produce results that are honest, that say where we have failed, that are not protecting ourselves to the detriment of victims, and that show an honest recognition of the horrors of this and an honest recognition of our need for change and accountability. That to me, at every step, what I'm looking for is, who does this protect? Is this true? If it is not verifiably true, if immediately we have a huge outcry from victims saying, this is manipulative, this is wrong, if it looks like we are protecting ourselves, if it looks like the executive committee's release before Grant and Ronnie made their motion, where they said, we haven't done anything wrong, but we're just getting this done to show you that we've done the right thing. If that is the posture going forward, then we have failed, and I will see you in Anaheim, and I will see you in Charlotte, and I will see you at every convention going forward until we get this right. And I don't think I'm the only one. I think there's a ton of us that feel that way. It's time to be honest.
And I want to stress, I think one of the keys to making sure we get it right is how much pastors and leaders are willing to listen to survivors. All right. We are not the experts on this. And I heard Hannah Kay say this once to somebody. I thought that's a great way to put it. And it needs to be shouted from the rooftops. Like, they've been driving this train for a long time, and we've just hopped on board their train. Okay. And so we're here for them. And so if what we need to do is we need to be a megaphone for their voices. They are much more familiar with the needs that survivors have. They are much more familiar with actions that can be taken that will help protect themselves in the future, that with ongoing needs that survivors have, that because just exposing something that was done wrong is not the end. Now survivors have to live with this for the rest of their life, and how our church is going to come alongside them in the aftermath, and how is our convention, if our convention at the convention level entities have been responsible for creating trauma by continuing to mishandle cases, what actions are they going to take over the long haul to care for and to make up for what they've done? And so I think, to make sure we do go about this the right way and don't fumble the ball here, we've got to be very humble. Our leaders have to be very humble and listen to the voices of survivors and experts in this area, and not pretend, that we are the experts and that we've got it all figured out. When people start doing that, and they start getting prideful, and they start thinking they've got it all figured out when we don't have a clue, that's when we start to let people down and not do enough and get it wrong.
Yeah.
If I could just touch on a flip side of that, I think the analogy is exactly right from Hannah Kate. They've been driving this train and we're hopping on. We need to listen, but also we need to start taking initiative to act without having to be begged. It's time to actually put some experts in place, put some people who know what they're saying in place. Stop forcing abuse victims to do a national outcry before we actually act. Let's take the initiative to do the right thing first. We shouldn't have to be exposed so that we'll respond. And I think that the heart for that kind of action is there. The question is, will we do it? But we should not ask victims to re-traumatize themselves the second week of June every year when we decide we're going to finally pay attention again. It's time to take some initiative. And in the course of taking that initiative, do exactly what Grant said, which is listen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I would say stop to SBC leaders and pastors. Stop being scared of experts in this field. Stop saying about survivors and experts, they're just trying to burn the whole thing down. If I hear that one more time, I'm going to flip my lid. I mean, stop doing that. It's a way of discrediting experts. It's a way of discrediting survivors. And so, like Griffin said, we've got to put some experts at the helm here and not be afraid of that. Because here's the deal, the danger and the risk. Some people say, well, if we put people like that on the task force, or if we put people like that in leadership, they have a bias toward the survivor. We need people that are survivor centric at the helm here. We need people that will take up that cause, because the danger and the risk is not that innocent people in our convention are going to wind up being blamed for things they didn't do. That's not the danger. That's not going to happen. The danger and the risk is that we will continue to hide things that are happening.
Right.
And that's the danger.
Yeah. Hannah Kate, what about you? Oh, go ahead, Griffin. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, to Grant's point, when we look at victims and we see them as a threat to us, that tells you where we really stand.
Mm-hmm.
There are too many powerful people that are still getting a lot of influence and a lot of acclaim, or at least a lot of respectful silence when they should have been called out, rebuked, and removed. It is not us versus them. For these abuse victims, they are us. Susan Cadoni, who spoke at the convention 3 years ago, is a member of a Southern Baptist Church 2 hours away from where I am right now. This is not us versus them. Our children are not them. Sexually abused men and women are not them. They are us. And when people start pitting them as our opponents, or they're trying to hurt us, then I guess us really is just some sort of institutional mechanism and not the churches of the Southern Baptist Convention. And Grant is exactly right there. We got to stop. We got to stop that kind of talk.
Yeah. Hannah Kate, what about you? What about just anything that you are watching for? Anything that you would advise people to be watching for, or just something that you yourself you're going to be watching for these kind of things as this moves forward?
I'm going to be looking for areas and times when leadership tries to minimize the problem or pass the responsibility. I think those are our weakest points. And so anytime a leader tells me, well, I'd like to get on this, but I've got a full schedule, and I have to say, no, I need a follow-up. I need it on the books. That's a red flag for me. No matter how kind the person is, no matter how respectable the person is, if they are not giving their all to this issue, I'm going to be critical of them. If they are not following through and listening to survivors, if they are not being patient with survivors, I think one of the biggest shocks to me, just even in the last month, has been how the church, the people in the church who want to cover it up, I don't want to say the whole church, but the people in the church or the SBC who want to cover this up, how they will take survivors' trauma responses and weaponize them against the survivor. I mean, Grant was talking about how we don't want to watch the church burn. But then at the same time, 6 weeks ago, I tweeted, hey, I hate the SBC. And, that's come back out into the light. And now people are like, oh, she hates God. She hates the church. Well, you know what? We need pastors who are willing to say, hey, that response right there is an actual normal response to trauma, and we need to give grace for that. I'm going to be looking for people who are able to identify the difference between sin and a trauma response and see if they have grace and the stomach and the patience to bear it with us, with survivors.
Yeah. Yeah, this conversation has been so great. It's been such an honor talking to you guys. But I would love to close with one question. And so we've been, at the convention level for a lot of the conversation. Let's go to the local church level. So there are people who watch and listen to this. Some are SBC, others are not. Some of them are, pastors, leaders in church. And then a lot of the people that are watching and listening to this, they're not pastors. They're just, a part of a church in some way, shape, or form. I thought earlier Hannah Kate gave some really good practical things that she would like to see local churches do. And Griffin and Grant, I know you guys are local pastors. I'm going to give this question to all three. So Hannah Kate, I'll come to you in a second because earlier you gave quite a bit. So you can say the same thing again, or you can give us some new things. But Griffin and Grant, I would love to hear what are some things you are doing in your church to lead your church in this area, to use the words that Grant gave earlier, to make your church as a safe place. What are you doing for survivors? And just answer it in terms of speaking to audiences, speaking to the audience rather of, oh, wow, this is a new thing for me. I knew this was an issue. I didn't know how prevalent it was. I want to lead my church in this. Griffin, we'll start with you. What are some things that maybe you're doing in your local context that you can pass along to the audience?
Yeah, well, let me say, I think Grant may be more helpful here. So if you're listening at home, pay attention to him because he's been a pastor longer than me. But just some basic things I am trying to do is in preaching, mention it.
Hmm.
We talk about grave sins or significant sins. If Grant is right that 1 in every 4 women, 1 in every 6 men have been sexually abused, when we talk about the grave sins and evil in the world, we talk about sexual abuse. That way they know I'm tuned in. And if it happens, you can come and talk to me. Notice it in your biblical exegesis. Like, who's to say that Bathsheba wanted to speak with David and was not pressured into a sexual tryst because he's the king? There's some dynamics at play in biblical narrative about sexual abuse. In fact, this past week at my own church, there was a question. I had a conversation with a church member about how much should we mention sexual sin in preaching or teaching when children are present. I'd mentioned David's own sin, and I said, well, it's hard to find other examples because Noah had his nakedness uncovered and was ashamed. Lot slept with his daughters. David forced Bathsheba into a sexual relationship. Solomon had concubines and was an adulterer. Judah slept with Tamar as a court prostitute. Dinah was raped. This is not uncommon in the biblical narrative. And what's amazing is that preachers can exegetically and expositionally preach the Bible and not even notice people being pressured into sex, not even notice powerful men taking advantage of women sexually in the Bible, not even notice sexual abuse. So I think it starts there. And then the second thing, and I'll just leave it here, is my church doesn't have any policies on this. I've been here for 4.5 months. They're all super well intended. They want to do what's right. I have pulled together my chairman of deacons, his wife, who has experience in early childhood education, a school administrator, myself, my wife, who ran a child daycare, people who have some professional experience in these areas, and said, hey, let's read the Caring Well Challenge book together, and let's develop a process for how we respond to claims of sexual abuse. So these people are told, we call the police first, we document this, this, and this, we preserve X, Y, and Z. Let's write those processes out together. Let's codify them. Let's put them in our church constitution and bylaws. Let's have our deacons adopt them. And let's make sure we have a standing committee that deals with these things. The other thing, I think, just a short third thing, is because I am not an expert on these things, I'm not a biblical counselor. I understand the language of trauma. I worked for the Alabama Baptist Children's Home in the past. I dealt with a lot of kids who were sexually abused, women who were abused and trafficked through that ministry. I understand the language. I know the problems. I think I know how to minister and show grace as much as I can to some people in those situations. But I think the best thing a pastor can do is recognize what you do not know, and please do not try to wing it. Please do not try to ad-lib these conversations. Recognize and identify professionals in your area, have those numbers on hand, and be able to draw those professional counselors, therapists, police, investigators in. If you have never had an issue of sexual abuse in your church, have an agency identified that could do an audit if a claim is made. I just am not an expert. I'm passionate about fixing this, but I'm not on the committee that Ed Litton formed because I'm not the expert on this issue. And I think that, or the task force, I think that just knowing what we don't know and showing a little bit of humility would have gone a long way over the last 70 years of mishandling this in our convention. And so I just want to admit that and put some systems in place to mitigate my own ineffectiveness.
Yeah. Grant, same question to you.
We have some policies in place right now, but we're beefing them up. So we're in the process of trying to beef them up. And a lot of the things that Griffin said are what we're in the process of doing. Having a standing group of people, a committee that champion this, putting that together. I think doing a lot of awareness training, for abuse awareness training for all of our volunteers and staff. And part of that is so that if you're going to volunteer at our church, or if you're going to come on staff at our church, you're going through awareness training. And one of the things that does is it signals to them, okay, these people know about grooming tactics. These people know about the grooming process. I might find an easier target somewhere else, and they're just not going to come to this church. They'll find the path of least resistance and go somewhere else. It gives them an out. And so beefing up those kind of things. And then also don't make the mistake of just trying to handle cases of abuse that you do hear about at the church disciplinary level. Realizing that criminal activity needs to go through the right channels and be dealt with by the criminal justice system. So reporting, and there are it's illegal not to report these things to the police. And so you've got to figure out what your state laws are on that and make sure you're abiding by those things. And so a lot of those things, just some of the best practices that are out there. Again, if anybody's looking for a good resource, this book is really good, and it walks you through exactly what to do. It's a policy guide, and it after every chapter, it's got example statements on policies, and so you can put those things together for yourself and for your church and have them adopted and then use them.
I never even heard of that, so I'm going to just order that right now.
Yeah, what's the name of that book there for people that are just listening to the audio? What's the name of that book?
All right, it's called Child Safeguarding Policy Guide for Churches and Ministries by Boz Titcheven, and Boz is the executive director of Grace, which is Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. You know a lot about Grace, Hannah Kate. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so he started it. He's actually no longer directing it. He has actually just in the last week formed his own law firm and opened it up to survivors of abuse within the church so that he may advocate for them. And I actually know several people whom he's been advocating as their attorney in litigation for. So he's a very well-respected attorney and advisor in the survivor community.
Cool. That's awesome. We'll link to that in the show notes so that it's easier for people to find. And Hannah Kate, same question to you. Anything that you would add? Like I said earlier, you mentioned some great things, and just anything that you would want to add for church leaders or just people that are a part of a church, what they should be doing.
Yeah, so I think the conversation is good to have in recognizing where we're experts and where we're not. But I think with that, we also have to be careful not to let that be a scapegoat for the areas of ministry that God may call us to in individuals' lives. A lot of us, we have been hurt by the place that was supposed to be safe for us. And actually, I'll read you something Krista Brown wrote. And I think it communicates what churches need to know about caring for survivors. She says, "We are people who have been violated and degraded, not only physically, emotionally, and psychologically, but also spiritually. The very essence of who we are, our very souls, are sullied, stomped, stripped, and subjugated. And how are we to heal when our primary resource for healing, our faith, is something we can no longer trust? How are we to heal when the part of our brain that held our faith is now the scorched land of the predator, and our instinct is to now run from it?" I think about those words, and I think about where I'm at in my own life right now. And there's so many times I want to be a part of a church, and I want to be healed. I want to feel like I contribute to church. I want to feel like the church sees me as more than a survivor of sexual abuse. But because of the trauma that I've been through, I might open the Bible and I immediately have the voice of my abuser in my head. I go to church and they sing the same songs that my abuser had playing on the computer while he was abusing me, you know? And sometimes the healthiest thing for a survivor is to have to step away from the church building itself and for the church to follow them out. If you think about the two stories, the two blind men in the Bible, you know, there was the one who Jesus actually took outside of the village. He took his time. He didn't say, no, I'm going to heal you right here in this place with these people. No, he took that individual outside of the village to provide him healing. And then also with the other blind man, you think about just how messy the process of healing is for a survivor. If you're going to walk with a survivor, you're going to walk through panic attacks. They're going to be suicidal at times. Sometimes when they're suicidal, the worst thing you can do for them is to call 911 because of the trauma that they've been through. So sometimes you're going to have to show up at 3 o'clock in the morning and sit with them and speak truth into their life. And, you know, when you think about that second blind man, what did Jesus do? Jesus is the ultimate physician. He could have healed the blind man with this magnificent big show, clean. No, he stuck his hands in the mud. He stuck his hands in the messy, the dirt. And he spit on the blind man's eyes and he put the mud on his eyes. And what was the first response? The first response was, are the trees walking? So Jesus didn't even completely heal him right then the first time. He actually, it was after the second time that the man's eyes were completely restored. And so just like these images of sometimes seeing a survivor and their value means giving them the space to walk out of the traditional church setting and going after them, and then getting your hands into the messy and the mud and the pain that is the process of healing, and being patient when healing doesn't happen the first time you try for it.
Yeah, that's a good
If
word.
I could just add one thing I just thought of, and it hasn't been said, but it's been hinted at. Hannah Kate has talked about trauma and counseling and therapy. And if your church is able in any way, set aside money to help victims of abuse.
Yes.
One of the worst things about being a victim of abuse is once you lose your family, once you lose your husband, once you lose your job, once you lose the things that trauma can cost you, you are in a tough spot. And if nothing else, churches could pay for the therapy. They may not be able to help every victim everywhere in every instance, but I hope that churches will at least set aside some kind of fund. If your church has an endowment, isolate part of it. If you don't, build a savings fund. Go Dave Ramsey on this thing, build an emergency fund. We need to have some funds available in case this happens in our congregations. And the other thing we haven't mentioned is all Baptist entities are autonomous, not just the national ones. Advocate for these exact same things at your local association and at your state convention, and ask them to do the same thing, to set aside funds. We can't just say like, man, I hope you get the help you need and I'll give you emotional support. If wrong happens in our midst, we need to do the best we can. Look, I know most churches are under 100 people. Most churches are not rich. Most churches aren't going to be able to have a $10,000 therapy fund. But if you can do something, do it. Help as much as you can.
Yeah, because I will say that people don't realize what it's like when you, for one thing, when you speak out, you lose your entire family. And you know, for a lot of people who have come out of abusive homes, you know, they're trying to go to college. Well, you know, they can't get a loan, or they can't even register for school unless some pastor writes a letter saying they're independent. And even when they are independent, you know, they don't have the resources to pay for tuition. They don't know how to set up health insurance. They don't know what health insurance is. They don't know the importance of going to the doctor or what a doctor is for. And you know, like, that's the financial side. I mean, I know so many survivors, their monthly, even with insurance, their monthly cost for prescriptions at times can be $1,300 a month. And that's not including all of the therapy. And then the inability to work at times and to not be able to provide for themselves. So there is the financial component of it, but there's also just a loss of family. And you don't know how many survivors spend holidays absolutely alone, and they spend birthdays alone, and they spend hard days alone because they don't have a mom or a dad. They don't have a grandparents. They don't have a church a lot of times that will stand by them after they've spoken out. And so even if you can't provide the financial, if you can provide the parts that make them feel like they're still human, that's one of the biggest things you can do for them.
Sexual abuse is a great time to be the church. How many times do we say that? Time to be the church. Be the church. Welcome them in. Give them a family. Care for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a powerful word, I think, to end on. And man, this has been so good. Thank you guys for your willingness to sacrifice time to come on here. I think this has been really helpful. I think this is going to help a lot of people. And we'll continue to watch and pray as this story unfolds. And I know that my contact with all three of you, Grant and Griffin, I'm just meeting for the first time. It's been great to meet you guys. Hannah Kate, it's great to connect with you again. But my connection with all three of you has been through Twitter. And so we will link to where people can find you on Twitter, follow you on Twitter. Is that the best place where people can just hear more of your content, learn more from you all, and connect with you? Would be on Twitter, probably? Looks like. Okay.
Probably.
Okay. All right. All right. Hey, thank you guys so much for taking the time to do this. This has been great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Mark.